What you're about to see is an excerpt from an interview recently conducted with my colleague Armin and a professor who is uniquely qualified to speak to the issues that are happening right now between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Of course, we historians are not in the business of making prognostications, and even as we speak, we are witnessing these very horrific scenes playing out in Nagorno-Karabakh, where there's this high intensity conflict taking place between Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, of course, with Armenia, and against Azerbaijan. And we are seeing some very disturbing footage of indiscriminate shelling of Armenian towns and villages. And we're not political analysts so far as I know, but how can we best understand the historical roots of this conflict, Professor? Well, a lot of people will sometimes say, let's go back 2,000 years and say, there was this province of Artsakh where we have examples of amazing Armenian architecture, including churches and monasteries. Others will say, let's look back 100 years and the decisions that were made by the Bolsheviks once Armenia and Azerbaijan, which were, of course, independent republics from 1918 to 1920, were incorporated into the Soviet fold.
Unfortunately, Ottoman history does not help us in this. In fact, history may be a burden. History may in fact, lead us in the wrong way. So everybody can make historical claims. They'll find a cemetery that was Muslim, or they'll find a church that was Armenian. Because when these areas were imperial areas, right, ruled by the Persians, later by the Russians, etc., people moved around. And you would have a town like Shushi, which was an Azeri town or Muslim town, and later was cleansed and made into an Armenian town, and then was cleansed and made into an Azeri town, and then cleansed and made into an. So people moved around. Empires are about mixing of peoples, and nation states are about unmixing of peoples. And what we're seeing is in the Soviet period, and now the post-Soviet period, the unmixing, the making of ethno-centered, ethnically homogeneous nation states, Azerbaijan on one side, Armenia on the other. And you have two principles that are fighting each other. One is, this was our land, we were there first. And there are different claims to that, right? Both sides claim to be descended from the Assyrians, the Caucasian Albanians, right? Well, Caucasian Albanians were a people there, they had a language, they eventually converted to Armenian Christianity, and they assimilated into Armenians. They became Armenians. Armenians came there. There may have been other Caucasian Albanians in the valleys, in the plains of Karabakh, who became Muslim, right? So those things happen. Many people who are today Armenian or are Turks or Kurds in Western Armenia, in Eastern Turkey, in the Caucasus, may have the genes of other people, because that's the nature of empire. Mixing, intermarriage, rape, pillage, and so forth. So people mixed. And in the days of the nation state, we try to unmix them, right? Which is also a utopian project and can lead to genocide, right? We want to be pure, so we got to get rid of those guys. We want the land, but we don't want the people on the land. So it's a very dangerous thing. So history can be difficult. But there are two other principles that are in conflict. One is the principle that the Azeris will propose, which is recognized by international law, which is territorial integrity. Karabakh, at the time of the end of the Soviet Union, was an autonomous region within Azerbaijan. So the international community recognizes that the Soviet Republic borders are the legal borders. Karabakh was in Azerbaijan, it belongs to Azerbaijan. But there's a contrary principle, and that's a good old Woodrow Wilsonian, Vladimir Lenin principle of national self-determination. And that is that the people who are on that land should determine and be allowed to rule themselves in some form, as an autonomous zone, as a nation state, etc. 90% of Karabakh was Armenian when the Bolsheviks gave it to Azerbaijan. By the time the conflict started in 1988, it had fallen to 75%. Hey, 75%? That's a pretty good claim of national self-determination. Now, of course, after the conflict began, the Armenians drove out the Azerbaijanis, or they ran away, right? And they now have 100%. And the Armenians, face the facts, have taken over a large chunk of Azerbaijan, which was never part of Karabakh. They have about 20%, 15 to 20%, I don't have exact figures, of Azerbaijan is in Armenian hands. Armenia did
I
not
think it's
start.
about 9% from what I've read.
I'll give you any percent you like. Okay. Maybe you're talking about the 9% outside of Karabakh, right? Yeah. Plus
13% total is, I think, what I
All right, that's a
remember.
good figure. So you can imagine that Armenians are perfectly content with the status quo antebellum, before this current war. They don't want to change it. They've got the land. They're going to settle people in those lands, etc. The Azerbaijanis want that status quo to change. So if you're looking for who attacked whom, it's not hard to find. The Azerbaijanis want to change this. Negotiations, compromise, armistice has not worked in their favor, and so they went to war. And the war is brutal, and it's supported by Turkey, and they're bringing Syrian mercenaries there who were extremely brutal people who fought against and murdered Kurds in northern Syria. So this is a disaster. And my big question is, where is Russia? Where is Armenia's major ally at this moment of existential danger to Karabakh and the Republic of Armenia?
Well, that actually was a question I want to look at, or maybe we could discuss. Going back in time just a little bit, I know referring to Russia maybe not necessarily appropriate by 1920, 1921, at the very least it was Soviet Russia. What exactly was the Bolsheviks' approach to this issue of untangling the Gordian knot, right? I think they issued these very self-congratulatory declarations in 1921, 22, saying that we finally resolved the nationalities issue and there should be no more enmity between Armenians and Azerbaijanis or Georgians, let alone the other numerous ethnic groups that made up what was going to become the Soviet Union at the time. But how exactly did the Bolsheviks, and maybe if we can also talk about Joseph Stalin, who was the commissar for nationality affairs at this time?
There's no mystery to what happened, right? So the Bolsheviks were faced with the reality that there were a number of republics that had been formed before the Soviets came, the Red Army came, and these became Soviet republics, right? And during that period, some areas, like Karabakh, had been fought over between Muslims and Armenians. Eventually, the Bolsheviks decided, first they gave Karabakh to Armenia. Then the Azeris protested. Then they changed their mind. Stalin was involved in that decision. And the decision was made because Azerbaijan was richer than Armenia. They had oil. The roads went to Baku rather than over the mountains to Yerevan or whatever. There were a number of reasons why they did it. And they thought they could solve this problem by ethnographically making boundaries that conformed to the various nationalities and giving autonomy to this majority Armenian region, Nagorno-Karabakh, right? But it turns out that the autonomy was fake. It wasn't real. Sovereignty lay with Moscow and with Baku. And so the Armenians of Karabakh did not really have real autonomous self-rule. And by Gorbachev's time, they wanted to join Armenia. And they protested. People were in the streets. There were massacres in Sumgait and killings back and forth. And eventually, this conflict developed. So it's a complex thing. And international law tells you one thing, that territorial integrity should prevail. But this principle of national self-determination, which is ingrained both in the old Soviet constitution and Leninist practice and Wilsonian preferences, etc., also plays a role. And that's what the conflict is about. Now, some years ago, around the late 1990s, very distinguished political scientist who was my colleague at Chicago when I was in a political science department, and now is at Stanford, and I, David Layton, wrote an article in which we tried to argue that you should compromise, that we could make, you could have de jure sort of official control of Karabakh by Baku, maybe a flag over the city hall or whatever. But de facto, the local people should rule themselves, right? So we made a proposal like that. Ter Petrosyan, the first president of independent Armenia, made a very similar proposal. He was constitutionally thrown out. Karabakhsis took over the rule of Armenia for a long time, until the recent democratic revolution 2 years ago. And so no solution has been found. And when no solution is found for a very long time, and people are entrenched, ultimately somebody, and in this case Azerbaijan, is going to try to solve this problem through violence rather than through negotiation and discussion.
And would it be correct to say that, because we touched upon the fact that there was instances of violence that had broken out between Armenians and Azeris even before the Soviet Union had came in and forcibly imposed its own solution in 1904 up until I think 1906. In the midst of the first Russian Revolution, there was these outbreaks of violence and massacres between these two ethnic communities, and apparently the imperial Russian government is able to impose some sort of order, and that only remains in place until the October Revolution comes about and the Russian Empire disintegrates. And would it be correct to say that there was never an ability to, there never really was the opportunity to reconcile traumas that had existed before then during the 70 years of Soviet rule? Was it just a case of the Soviet authorities clamping down on any effort to discuss this in a truthful way, and rather imposing this artificial notion of brotherhood among nations and Druzhba Narodnaya as was constantly championed. Narodov. Mm-hmm.
I've spent a lot of my career fighting this notion. So when these conflicts began, when the Soviet Union began to dissolve, the general understanding was, there are ancient tribal struggles. These people have always fought each other. Look at 1904, 1905. Look at 1918. And now look at what's happened since 1988, right? Leaving out that centuries go by that the Soviet Union for 70 years kept the peace, right? So, and there were struggles, there were conflicts. I had an Armenian aunt who lived in Baku. I stayed with her. The Armenians lived peacefully with Azerbaijanis for a very long time. They got along well. But of course, I did notice that every time my aunt Nuna talked about Azerbaijanis, she did it rather condescendingly. Those people, Turk, they're Turks. So there was this sense of Armenian superiority over Azerbaijanis, etc. But even so, a constitutional arrangement, different times can change things. So we mustn't think of these as indelible, essentialist conflicts that must exist for all time. Nationalists would like you to think that. But in fact, we can imagine arrangements where people don't do that. There's less conflict today, for instance, between Hungarians and Romanians, with hundreds of thousands of Hungarians living within Romania, than there have been in earlier times. We are a population as Americans who in fact conquered a continent and drove the native people into reservations. There were savage wars. Are we to predict that today that enmity must in fact indelibly continue? Or are there ways that concessions can be made, recently by the Supreme Court, to recognize the rights of those people? I'm talking about Native Americans, not Afro-Americans who have their own complaints and own grievances that should be recognized, right? But at least with some Native Americans, arrangements can be made to alleviate those old conflicts. So I remain, as a person of the left, always optimistic, believing that human beings, under certain conditions, with the right institutions, can solve these problems. When that fails, what do you get? You get violence, you get warfare. This is a failure. This is a failure. This present war is a failure of Armenians, who had controlled that area, of Azerbaijanis, who couldn't find solutions, of the Russians and the international community that's allowed this thing to fester now for 30 years.
Again, this was an excerpt from a longer interview, which will be posted shortly. It's about an hour-long interview, and that'll be up within the next week or so if you want a greater context of what's going on. And I think it's important to pass this along because this is an important issue happening in our world, and it could lead to a much bigger conflict that none of us want to see. So please subscribe, share, like, comment, or you could even dislike and comment. I don't care. But it's important that we are aware of what's going on in the world today.